Good morning, distinguished colleagues and participants. Welcome to the 8th edition of the Spotlight series, sponsored by the University of the West Indies St. Augustine Unit of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, with support, of course, from the Marketing and Communications Department. I am Lionel Remy. I have been active in the behavioral science discipline of social work for the past 49 years. When Kathy Ann Modest, Secretary to the Director of Salisters, invited me to act as chair of this session, this was an invitation that I could definitely not refuse. The Spotlight theory and the Spotlight methodology are very interesting. It is a design that facilitates a researcher to present work in their field of expertise that focuses attention. In fact, it shines the light on a major area of knowledge that has the capacity to transform scholarship into application. The objective of Dr. St. Bernard's presentation is to demystify official statistics and statistical analysis by demonstrating its relevance to everyday life and living in the Caribbean space. His talk emphasizes the need to move beyond rhetoric, and he will propose the adoption of practices that highlight the reverence that ought to be placed upon statistics as an enterprise. The presenter will shed light on his concept and contribution to the field of development statistics. We can all agree that reliable statistics are essential for measuring progress in reaching development goals and providing essential information about the effectiveness of policies and programs. By way of introduction, I've known Dr. St. Bernard and his passion and phenomenal output, scientific acumen, and impactful scholarship since 1985. He's undeniably a statistician and demographer with an unenviable international reputation for thoroughness, comprehensive, accurate analysis, incisive reporting, and a reputation for project completion within agreed time cycles and impeccable quality. His ability to motivate and mobilize team resources and collegial support is outstanding. His energy, leadership, his reach, and collaborative style with colleagues in the Caribbean and in international university research networks, in addition to social service agencies in the Caribbean, are models of excellence. He has an unrivaled track record in providing social policy direction to contemporary social problems based on his appropriate deployment of an integrated architecture of qualitative and quantitative methodologies supported by IT frameworks. During his assignment as Director of Salisters between October 2021 and July, as we speak, researchers, scholars, practitioners, and students were nourished with a range of data servings and innovative programs that were signature St. Bernard products. Several data sharing mechanisms were created under his directorship, and some of them are as follows. The virtual forums, of which he was able to ensure that 18 were presented, and topics such as education, disaster management, development finance for low carbon futures, the impact of COVID, carnival, spirituality, religion and morality, budgeting, food security, national statistics, violence against women, and a very popular one, gun-related violence and criminal homicide in Caribbean societies, data-driven insights and expert reflections towards ameliorative actions. That particular virtual forum saw 188 participants attending. He also led and developed spotlight presentations, 7 of which have been held prior to this. Today makes the 8th. And in addition to that, he held 3 conferences, the UWI Toronto Metropolitan Conference, in which focused on the well-being of children and families in Central America and the Caribbean, Then there was another conference on the Black Power Revolution, so held sometime in April 20th, 21st. And then the 24th Annual Solicitors Conference, which focused on 75 years of innovation and development justice. In addition to that, the sixth form webinar was an interesting innovation, in which 13 schools attended between January 2022 and 23. In terms of Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard's biography, his early work and academic information between 1980 and 1987, he worked as a statistician in the Central Statistical Office in Trinidad and Tobago and was responsible for the production of social and vital statistics. He obtained a BA Mathematics and Economics, 1980, from UWI St. Augustine, his MA in Sociology, 1989, and his PhD in Social Demography, 1993, from the University of Western Ontario, now Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. He was the recipient of a CEDA Fellowship during 1987 to 1991, and a Population Council Fellowship during 1991 to 1992. Among his publications, he was the co-author, or is the co-author of one book entitled Behind the Bridge, Power, Politics, and Patronage in Laventille, Trinidad, published in 1997, and a number of other monographs and technical papers. Additionally, he has authored more than 50 scholarly studies that have appeared in peer-reviewed journals as chapters in edited books and in other knowledge production formats. Google Scholar documents that he has 555 citations of his work by other researchers. He's also traveled globally and presented more than 180 papers at conferences on every continent. As a demographer and statistician and survey research specialist, Dr. St. Bernard has been the lead researcher on local, regional, and international projects. Since 2007, he has been the project leader on 2 additional international projects. During the period 2006-2009, he was co-leader of a CARICOM project that trained in excess of 100 Caribbean statisticians and senior research professionals in the use of formal demographic techniques of analysis. Dr. St. Bernard conceptualized and pioneered the establishment of the MSc in Development Statistics at Salises. He supervised 3 doctoral candidates and more than 100 candidates who read for their master's degrees. His research interests have focused on population dynamics and sustainable development, evidence-based decision-making in social policy research and practice, the well-being of children and youth, violence prevention and safety promotion, vulnerability and resilience in small states, and return migration. In 2012, in terms of his professional liaisons, he was the president of the Caribbean Studies Association and continues to serve CSA, sharing his experience with his membership. He is also a member of numerous professional associations in disciplines such as demography, sociology, and statistics. Since January 2020, Dr. St. Bernard has been the editor-in-chief, editorial board of the Journal of Caribbean Association of Professional Statisticians, SCAPS. So it is now my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. St. Bernard to the microphone to deliver his spotlight presentation entitled Championing Development Statistics, a Vow That I Kept. Welcome, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard.
Thank you very much, Lionel Remy, my distinguished colleague, for that introduction. Me pull up my presentation. Is everyone seeing it? Not as yet. Okay. Yeah. Is it up as yet? It's up? Okay, thank you again. My apologies for that short interruption. Thank you to my colleague, Mr. Lionel Remy, for the introduction. And I want to get swiftly into the presentation, which is really a reflection of my life in statistics, the drivers that prepared me for a career in statistics, accounting for some of the achievements, modest as they may be, and of course, some reflection on some of the disappointments, some of the high points, some recommendations, and perhaps the way forward. But before I do so, I want to pay respects to a dear colleague of mine, Dr. Henry Charles, who passed approximately 2 weeks ago. Dr. Henry Charles was a dear colleague of mine and indeed a dear colleague of many in the university and in public arenas internationally. As you can see, he was a recently minted PhD, class of 2021, graduating out of Salesius St. Augustine. So he was a student in our institute, and it gave me great pleasure to bestow upon him tokens of appreciation, which we do deliver to our graduating PhDs and master's students. Dr. Charles was not only a dear colleague, he was also a dear neighbor of mine. We lived in the same neighborhood space. And I can attest to numerous occasions when I sat in major international meetings with Dr. Henry Charles, and I can attest also to the high regard and the tremendous respect that was placed on his contribution. Those who knew him as the godfather of youth development work and youth development studies in the region. And I can say that having been with him in meetings, whether we were in Marlborough House in London, England, or in other meetings, whether in Jamaica, Guyana, Belize, just to name a few places where I sat in meetings with Dr. Charles, the respect was evident. And as I finish this presentation, I'm going to be heading off to St. Lucia to his funeral tomorrow, where I am expected to say and make a few more comments on his life, and at least that part of his life that he would have shared with me, having known him for at least 14 years. So at this point, respects to Dr. Henry Charles, Comrade Charlo, as some would refer to him, may he rest in eternal peace. Thank you, sir, for your contributions to humankind. So having said that, and having really paid my respects to Dr. Charles, who I'm sure would have been among the virtual audience had he been alive, I move straight into my presentation. And the presentation is entitled Championing Development Statistics, a Vow That I Kept. And in the 1970s and earlier, much of development discourse was predicated upon economic development triggered by economic growth. And when we think of economic growth, of course, we think in terms of a sustained temporal increase in national income, in national product. Gillis et al. 1987 noted that the key ingredient in economic development was national production propelled by nationals in a given territorial space. And this is important because it really highlights that distinction that we make between gross national product and gross domestic product. We want to be sure that our nationals, first and foremost, are heavily invested in the growth and development that takes place within our respective spaces. And I'm speaking here about development because I said, I'm here championing development statistics. And we have to have some context within which to frame the notion of development. So I want to use a definition of Todaro as far back as 1985. And although this definition is almost 40 years old, I think there was some foresight in terms of this particular definition. And I say this because in the earlier days, development as we thought about it was largely based on economic determinism. But of course, with recent developments, and in particular, the Sustainable Development Goals, we have recognized the multidimensional trust that prevail when we think in terms of development. And according to Todaro, development is seen as a multidimensional process involving the reorganization and reorientation of entire economic and social systems. In addition to improvements in income and output, it typically involves radical changes in institutional, social, and administrative structures, as well as in popular attitudes and in many cases, even customs and beliefs. So development as a phenomenon, it is multidimensional. It possesses components that are either economic or non-economic, including the interactions between the two. And it constitutes a physical reality and a state of mind that underpins trust towards a better life. So again, focusing on Todaro 1985, what are three critical objectives when we think in terms of development? Of course, one is to increase the availability and widen the distribution of basic life-sustaining goods such as food, shelter, health, and protection. And I think, by virtue of this definition, one can provide, one can actually recognize the importance of doing living standards measurement surveys, many of which had been funded by the Caribbean Development Bank back in the 1990s in a number of Caribbean countries. Of course, we have not seen many of these studies being done. I'll get back to that in a while. The second objective Todaro recognized was to raise levels of living, including, in addition to higher incomes, the provision of more jobs, better education, and greater attention to cultural and humanistic values, all of which will serve not only to enhance material well-being, but also to generate greater individual and national self-esteem. And third, to expand the range of economic and social choices available to individuals and nations by freeing them from servitude and dependence, not only in relation to other people and nation states, but also to the forces of ignorance and human misery. So already we are seeing that, to speak about development, it's not only multidimensional, it is multi-level, because we can speak of development from the standpoint of individuals, we can speak of development from the standpoint of social groups when you have individuals coming together as a collectivity, we can speak to development in terms of physical spaces such as regions of our country, whether we are talking about individuals who possess certain characteristics as a group, or whether we are speaking of a nation as a whole or a group of nations, such as when we speak about Latin America and the Caribbean. So we are already looking at not only a multidimensional phenomenon, but also a multi-level phenomenon. And then more recently, in accordance with the Brundtland report, in defining sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is important because what it also brings into vogue is not only, understanding human populations as cohorts, but also understanding period influences. And once we start talking about period influences, clearly we are speaking in terms of, a time dimension and temporal points and so on as the case may be. So having said all of that, my concern and my concentration, concentration with respect to sustainable development, if I were to really think about it, I would like to, first of all, identify several domains of it. It involves, there's an economic domain, a social domain, an environmental domain, an administrative domain, and they don't only stand on their own. They mix and combine and coalesce in several interesting ways to produce this phenomenon, this construct that we refer to as development. But when I think of development, I think in terms of, material well-being primarily, and social well-being. We are human beings, we exist, we have to have food, we have to have shelter and so on. There are certain material bases that we need in our lives to sustain our lives and to live. There's also subjective well-being, and of course, time matters, because to talk about development, you have to really focus on status at a particular point in time and how that status may change or transit or transform as you go from one time point to another. Of course, there's a human dimension, there's an institutional dimension, there's a spatial dimension, right? There's a human dimension, institutional dimension, and spatial dimension that is critical in the scheme of things. So to talk about development, we are talking about development from the standpoint of human beings, whether we look at them in the context of their individual state or as a collectivity, in whatever forms they may take. It's also about the institutions where human beings mix and interact to facilitate the basic needs of humankind and the survival of the overarching system, and of course spaces. So there are all of these dimensions. Distribution is a big concern, and I say distribution because oftentimes we think in terms of development as a quantum measure. It is measured quantitatively in terms of how we may operationalize what is material and material well-being. And the greater the quantitative, the magnitude of the quantitative index that provides some measure of material well-being, the greater the greater importance we ascribe to progress as far as development is concerned. But there's that question of distribution. And I say this because at the end of the day, development would not have taken place in a society where, of course, you have a greater expression of well-being, but at the same time, you are talking about, greater inequity and greater inequality. And I speak to this because oftentimes in public discourse, I hear people making statements about equal rights and equality and equity. And I ask myself, do they know what they're really talking about? How do they know we are achieving gains with respect to equity and achieving greater equity in society? From the position I hold, there's only one way: you have to measure. And as statisticians, we do have a whole host of techniques that we use to measure and to determine levels of equity and whether we are achieving gains in that regard. So to talk about it, I mean, I can give you an example. We might be looking at, populations that live in different, that have different characteristics. Let's say, for example, socioeconomic status. And we might look across socioeconomic status, and in our country, such as Trinidad and Tobago, I suppose it doesn't matter, which socioeconomic status group you belong to. Everybody has equal access to education at the secondary level. And that might be judged on the basis, well, of course, when you look at the population in the lower socioeconomic groups and you look at the population in the upper socioeconomic groups, you may find that, yes, 99%, I mean, there's that tendency for the proportion attaining secondary level education to be equal. But is there equity, right? And equity may have to do with the quality of the education that one achieves. So although there's equality, there might not be equity in terms of the quality. And to achieve that equity, a number of other factors have to enter the equation to bring about that equity, including legislative process that may involve, some mechanism put in place to ensure that that's the case. I make the point about wealth more than income. And again, I think when we talk about development, it's not enough to speak about income, but I think more importantly about wealth as a store of income. And development justice is the icing on the cake in terms of, at the end of the day, how do we legislate and how do we facilitate behaviors and attitudes that would approximate, some of the goals that are characteristic of a just society where equity prevails and where equity can be maximized. And again, I think, by virtue of the work that statisticians do, especially through living standards measurement surveys, these kinds of agendas could be fulfilled. So having said all of that, what is this thing we call development statistics? And I would think, development statistics is really about mixing and combining a range of knowledge generation skills to facilitate decision-making in the context of advocating and contesting development agendas. And what are these knowledge generation skills I'm talking about? We have to know, we have to align ourselves and come to terms with the rule of the philosophy of science. What about the rule of theory? What about the rule of methodology? And when we start to think in terms of methodology, conceptualization, measurement and classification, data collection in terms of whether we do sample surveys, population censuses, administrative data, and other means. What kind of quality control mechanisms we put in place to ensure that the data we collect are in fact valid data. the statistical data analysis and the technical savvy associated with it. How do we interpret statistical results? How do we write our statistical report and disseminate our findings? So all of these skills are absolutely critical in the scheme of things. And the linkages between the statistical results and policy processes in terms of whether we are talking about framing policy, implementing policy, monitoring policy, evaluating policy, and making recommendations. How do these statistical results at the end of the day facilitate the policy process? And these are important dimensions which, in my estimation, you know, coming back to Trinidad and Tobago with a PhD in demography, and I remember one Barbara Boland, Dr. Boland, who was then associated with UNECLAC, she said to me one day very early, Godfrey, you know, when you come back here with this PhD in demography, you would not be doing the formal demography that you guys learned. You will have to really apply that development process. And she was so right, you know, when I reflect upon the career that I've had. So I want to move from that discourse on development and speak now about, you know, some of my early encounters with statistics and what sort of drove me in this direction to the point that I ended up having a career in demography and statistics. And it has, and I entitled this slide Arithmetic Statistics, and it really was, you know, reflecting on what I did when I did arithmetic in primary school, right? I learned to count. I learned about decimals, fractions, and percentages. I learned about multiplication. And everyone who's listening to this, who was born in the 1960s, could remember having sums in arithmetic where your teacher would ask you to calculate the average scores of Sobers, Canai, Lloyd, Hunt, and others, Worrell and others. Back then, we were engaging in statistics in arithmetic. The mere fact that we were learning to count, statisticians do that. Statisticians enumerate, statisticians take population censuses, we count, right? That is an act of engagement in what statisticians do. Decimals, fractions, percentages. When I did my degree in mathematics, I remember learning about the real number line. And the real number line is an infinite set of numbers. And I mean, it's not only about whole numbers, there are parts of whole numbers, and we need to be able to account for that in terms of precision and measurement. That's statistics. That bit of knowledge contributes to a lot of what we do in statistics. And multiplication, the mere fact we can talk about, I'm sure you have heard, you know, people making statements about if you are a smoker, you are 5 times more likely to develop lung cancer than if you are a non-smoker. Now, don't quote me on that, but you have heard that kind of statement. That's multiplication at work, and so on. And again, you know, simple things that we did in primary school find its way in the kind of interpretive nuances we embark upon when we engage statistics. Now, I come here because I'm getting a little personal now. And what you see here is an aerial photograph of the community where I spent most of my childhood and adolescent life. It's Diamondville in Diego Martin. And I choose this because Diamondville, when I lived there in the 1960s, 1970s, Diamondville was a community where baby boomers grew up. So when you lived there, you perhaps would have had friends in households with 8 children, 7 children, and so on. And it turned out that Diamondville was a first for me in terms of appreciating some of the notions of development, you know, because I always reflected on it, and I said, yeah, you know, the kids I went to school with, lots of the people who went there to live were largely middle-class folk at the time. And in the 1960s and early 70s, passing common entrance was, I suppose, a big thing. And most of the kids in that community did pass common entrance, even if 30, 40% of the kids who sat common entrance actually got places in schools. And I mean, you were sort of encouraged to do well when you saw others doing well in that community. And it was a very special place where, you know, we assisted one another with our homework and so on. We shared books when among those who went to higher forms and so on, you passed the books on to your friends who were coming into the form that you were in, and so on. There was a lot of sharing with respect to food and so on. So one family cooks a meal and would share it with other families and so on. And that's the kind of upbringing that, you know, you had in that kind of community that really nurtured you and encouraged you to excel in a way that would play out well at the end of the day when you look at how your life would have evolved. And then in my own household, I had a father who was a mathematician. And I remember sitting in his maths classes when he would teach, and sometimes I would say things after him. So if he says A plus B equals C, I would say A plus B equals C, and I am in kindergarten, but he's teaching a class of fifth formers who are ready to do GCE and that sort of thing. And I think, you know, by that kind of exposure, somehow I developed an interest in mathematics. In the home, there were mathematics books of all kinds in the house, and I remember being in standard 5 or first form, but I am looking at materials in mathematics that would be done by fifth formers at much higher levels and so on, trying to come to terms with it because I lived in that kind of household. So I know, you know, a lot of what I did as a young student in mathematics had a lot to do with my father and how he nurtured me as I went along. But then I went to secondary school, and I went to a school in Trinidad, Trinity College in Mocha, and I met some fascinating teachers there as well. And again, the two maths teachers there, Mr. Martineau and Mr. M.G. Clark, both of them recognized my talent as a young student doing mathematics, and they encouraged me. In fact, both of them knew my father, and they encouraged me to do well and would always look out and ensure that I did well. And then there was Mr. Clark, the geography teacher, Mr. M.F. Clark, and Mr. Clark made geography, to me, a most interesting subject. And whenever I thought of geography while in his class, you know, I would think about, you know, people, places, cultures, and then I would think about the Earth's surface and what is above and below it. And in a sense, again, you know, thinking that way about geography triggered interest in development, and perhaps, you know, there is something beyond just what you do in a geography class that extends to so many other domains of life. So I really credit these three men for their contribution in shaping a lot of what I do, including my father, of course, you know, the mathematics background and the geography background. I think those were very important inputs. Now I want to reflect a bit on secondary education and what it does for statistics, because, I mean, when I think of O-level, I mean, I did O-level, people of my generation did O-level, today they do CSEC. And I think mathematics and additional mathematics are still subjects that are done. But I ask myself, statistics, where are statistics in O-level? And could there be a statistics subject statistics in CSEC, O-level, that really meets the needs of some students who might be that way inclined. I never knew of statistics when I did O-level. Nobody was talking about that. Everybody was talking about mathematics and additional mathematics. And then I went on to E-level, and based on what I said about geography and mathematics, obviously I did geography, mathematics as E-level subjects and economics. But then in the mathematics that I did at E-level, I did pure mathematics and mechanics. Fancy me as a young student who does not have a background in physics, right? Trying to grapple with mechanics in E-level mathematics. So already, I mean, even back then, I recognized perhaps, there was somewhat of a bias in favor of the students in the physical sciences when you did mathematics. Because I then remember, even at that time in Trinity College, I remember that there was a guy in Form 6 with me. I think his name is Dave Skinner. I remember Skinner saying, well, why don't we have an opportunity to do statistics as an A-level subject with pure maths? And that struck a chord with me. And then my first real lesson in statistics actually occurred in a geography class with Mr. Clark. Because somewhere along the line, there was a practical element of A-level geography in which statistics featured. So what I'm saying, statistics came out to me in a geography class and not a mathematics class, not even in an economics class. As a matter of fact, in economics classes, the relevance of mathematics was really showcased first and foremost, right? And the connection between statistics and the concepts in economics, somehow they were hardly evident, right? At least at that time. So fast forward now to UWI St. Augustine campus. And I want to recognize some 1970s UWI influencers. These were very powerful men in terms of, the kind of vibe they generated in their classes. And I start with Dr. Sincere, who I met in the first year, and that is when statistics really came alive. Of course, having a background in mathematics really helped to put it in context. And it made a lot of sense to me. All of a sudden, statistics came alive. And then he blended it with, the techniques that are involved in doing research. And I said, hey, this was the missing link all along. And this is what university education is all about. But then, having met Dr. Sincere in the first year, his teachings merged seamlessly with the teachings of Dr. Dev Gupta, who was an Indian from India, and he taught economic statistics. And when Dr. Gupta taught economic statistics, then I began to see a whole new world of statistics because I appreciated what was done by Dr. Sincere in the first year. And it just mushroomed into something so beautiful. And this was backed up by Dr. Thomas, Dr. Roy Thomas, who I will credit as the person who helped me to understand national income accounting as a subject area in economics. I had a full grasp of it, having been exposed to Dr. Thomas in the first year in university. And I think between Dr. Thomas, Dr. Gupta, and Dr. Sincere, all of a sudden, economics came alive. And of course, statistics and its role in economics blossomed. I said, whoa, there's something to be said about this. And I think that was one of the big epiphanies, I would say, because all along I think I did mathematics and economics. I just wanted to be a teacher like my father. But having met these men and what they did, I said there is something more to just being a teacher in a secondary school teaching maths or economics. And then in the final year, I met Dr. Carl Theodore, who taught econometrics, and the relevance of metrics and measurement and measuring economic phenomena and modeling based on theories and developing models and obtaining data that you can use critical statistical techniques to see to what extent these data support or refute hypothetical statements that may be conveyed or not conveyed in the models and so on. I think, Dr. Theodore did a wonderful job in pulling all of that together. But I did maths as well. And in the maths department, there were those like Dr. E.J. Farrell, who taught algebra, abstract algebra, linear algebra. And linear algebra was critical in appreciating a lot of the things that Dr. Carl Theodore did in econometrics. And linear algebra did play a major role in my appreciation of the whole question of vectors and how vectors apply in some of the work I eventually went on to do as a demographer in terms of population estimation and the high-level techniques that you can use drawing on mathematics and statistics. And then, of course, there was David Owen, Dr. David Owen, who taught a higher level mathematical methods course in analyzing based on real number analysis and that sort of thing. And Dr. Philbert Morris, he did some work with us that took us beyond A-level mathematics into higher level mathematical thinking and so on. So put all of this together, an interesting character was emerging in terms of, a suite of skills that I think was so important in developing one's career path. And I move on now to say a few things about UWI. Back then, some of the issues I had back then, of course, it was difficulty accessing computer science courses, right? You wanted to do a computer science course, but they were very rigid in terms of, stepping out of your domain, so to speak. So that was one of the areas, the sore areas I had with my existence in UWI back then. But doing mathematics and economics, of course, teaching was an option. I toyed around with the notion of doing actuarial science. And having been exposed to, the likes of the goodly fellows I mentioned a while ago, being a statistician, being a financial analyst, although I had a stint working in a bank and didn't like it. So being a financial analyst, I don't think I wanted to follow in the area of finance and money. So another powerful thing back in those days at UWI, when I was in the second year, during that time as an undergraduate student, CSO, and I'm talking about CSO now because CSO takes a lot of licks for no good reason, right? CSO in those days made provisions for providing apprenticeship opportunities for young people who were doing degrees in economics, sociology, even those doing mathematics. CSO made provisions to mentor them. And I saw it back then. I mean, in hindsight, I say, well, this was one way of winning allies for statistics, because it's certainly one big ally. I became a statistician because of that offer of being apprenticed in the CSO during the summer period in 1979, right? And that exposure crystallized the notion of statistics as a career. It really reinforced the relevance of statistics to national policy. And I worked there as a research assistant, not only in 1979 at the end, between my second and third year in the university, but after I completed my degree, I went back as a research assistant, as a statistical assistant, and worked again because of the rewarding experience I had in the CSO in 1979 while being apprenticed there. So I move on to another phase now, 1979, when I was at the CSO. 1980, I returned, and I ended up working in the CSO between 1980 and 1987. Now, each of those stints in the CSO, because of what I said about national income accounting, I had a grounding in national income accounting, and based on what I said about the impact of Dr. Thomas, I saw everything happening real time in front of me in national income accounting. And in both occasions, when I was there in 1979 and 1980, I could never forget the venerable Arthur Bruce, an extraordinary mentor, who, I mean, he was a fountain of knowledge in the CSO, and everybody who was into, you know, economic trends and economic patterns that prevailed in Trinidad and Tobago in the pre-independence era and in the early post-independence era. Once you were interested in economic facts and economic outcomes and so on, the venerable Arthur Bruce was the go-to man. And he was the senior statistician in national accounts at the time. And he mentored everybody in the CSO who worked in economic statistics, including me, right? May his soul rest in peace. Wonderful human being. But he also mentored Mr. Dave Clement and Mr. Peter Pariak, who were exceptionally gifted national income account statisticians who learned on the job, who were extensively trained overseas, and who were also very willing to share their expertise. And these two men were very close colleagues of mine from 1980 until their respective deaths. Dave Clement, who died last year, if I'm not mistaken, last year. So it's not even a year since he has passed, but by and large, I mean, these were the kinds of individuals who were in the CSO. But while in national accounts, a position opened up in social statistics in the CSO. And at that time, the World Fertility Survey was in motion. The World Fertility Survey was an international survey that was done in several developing countries across the globe, including Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Jamaica in the English-speaking Caribbean. And this was a survey that was really designed to understand, you know, fertility dynamics and birth outcomes. And it was really a way of, you know, understanding, you know, what could be factors that could be introduced to facilitate reduction in fertility, because this was a time when fertility levels were still relatively high in this part of the world. And of course, we had to, studies were done because there were efforts to reduce fertility, and if you understand, theories of fertility, you would understand what could be the triggers through the various phases that underlie, one of the more popular theories of fertility. What could be the triggers you can use? And these studies were studies that, of course, precipitated that. And I had the opportunity of working with Linda Hewitt, who, again, a demographer statistician, who was very young at the time, and I worked with her, and she, again, was very generous with her knowledge and very gracious in terms of ensuring that you grew as a youngster coming of age and so on. She, in many ways, mentored me in that process of becoming the demographer who I am today. Of course, spearheading the World Fertility Survey exercise was Mr. Jack Harewood, who was the first director, the first local director of this Central Statistical Office back in the 60s, and Norma Abdullah, who's also a demographer. And these two persons are noteworthy because Mr. Jack Harewood became the first director of ISA, which eventually became what we know as SALISIS today. And Ms. Abdullah was the deputy director of ISA under Jack Harewood. So here it is. I mean, these are very important figures in terms of, shaping, the tradition of demographic research. And when you look at ISA under Mr. Harewood, there was a plethora of demographic studies that were done based on international data and in surveys that were commissioned by international organizations to understand, a lot of what was happening with respect to the various demographic events in Trinidad and Tobago and in some other Caribbean countries as well. But I had the privilege of working with these individuals in those early days as a youngster coming out of university and so on. But and this slide here more or less shows, one of the World Fertility Survey meetings that was held in Trinidad. And you can see the likes of Mr. Harewood here, the father of Caribbean demography, George Roberts, this is he. And then this is Linda Hewitt here and Mr. Leo Pujadas in this corner here. Leo Pujadas was the successor to Jack Harewood as Director of Statistics. And of course, moving on from the World Fertility Survey, I ended up in the Population, Social and Vital Statistics Unit that was headed by Mr. Desmond Hunt, demographer, senior statistician, and Linda Hewitt was also the demographer statistician there. And I was a younger statistician working with these two senior officers who, as I said before, in those days, I think the point I want to make here is that CSO in Trinidad and Tobago in those days had two demographers, two qualified demographers. And this is tied to something I'm going to be speaking about as I progress in this talk, right? But I worked with these folk, and of course, working with these folk, you learn a lot because they were outstandingly brilliant and outstandingly well-trained. So what could I say in terms of my stint in population, social, and vital statistics in the CSO? Well, I was responsible for inputs into producing the vital statistics reports of Trinidad and Tobago. So all the statistics pertaining to annual births, annual deaths, marriages, divorces, population size changes. I was responsible for producing those statistics. I was responsible for producing the education statistics report on educational enrollment in primary, secondary schools and so on. And for foreign workers in Trinidad and Tobago, I compiled statistics on the human capital characteristics of these individuals through what was called a work permits report. In those days in the CSO, we organized what we called a staff seminars organizing committee. We had a staff seminars organizing committee. And it was really a set of young statisticians in their 20s and 30s inviting speakers to come to speak about statistics and its relevance to development process in Trinidad and Tobago and the region. And I was part of that. And it was a beautiful experience. The likes of the late Brian James, the late Dave Clement, among others, Dr. Philomene Harrison, Mr. David Thomas. These were the folk who I worked with in organizing some of these seminars. But a major divine intervention occurred in 1983. And it says something about the public service, you know, notwithstanding all of the beautiful things I have said about being in the CSO and the public service. I say this was a divine intervention because in 1983, there was a CELADI intensive demography course in 1983. CELADI is a Latin American demographic center with headquarters in Santiago, Chile. And this was a course to train Caribbean statisticians in undertaking demographic analyses and all of the formal techniques. It's critical training, right? And it was held right in that course was actually held physically in what is Salice's conference room today on the St. Augustine campus. And I remember sitting in my cubicle in CSO in Port of Spain, and Mr. Hunt passing by my door, and he said, Godfrey, what are you doing here? Why don't you go up to UE? There's a course going on up there. Go up there and see what you could pick up from the course. So I just left the office one time and I said, okay, I'm going up to UE. And when I got up to UE, I saw about 20-something students from all over the Caribbean doing this course. And everybody was given what was the Bible of demographic analysis at the time, the Shryock and Siegel, Methods and Materials of Demography. Everybody was given a copy of that book. And everybody was given a programmable calculator Texas instrument. In today's world, you would be given a laptop, right? And when I got there, the organizers of the course said, are you doing this? Are you going to do the exams? And they gave me everything and I was in the course. And needless to say, at the end of it, I topped the class. I came first in the course. And of course, you see the names of some of the folk who were there. These are top class persons in the field of demography in the day. John Blacker from London School of Economics, William Brass from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, William Brass, London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, Basha Zaba, London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, also with the UNECLAC, Jack Yearwood, George Roberts, Jorge Somoza from CELADI in Chile, and Dirk Jaspers from CELADI in Chile. These were the people who ran that course. And basically, what I'm saying here is that, you know, at the end of the day, I had exposure to this group and it transformed my life in so many ways, right? There was also later on a Caribbean population projection workshop in 1985, which I participated in. And I speak about that course in particular because there were people from CSO Trinidad who were actually selected to go. I don't think they lasted more than 2 or 3 more years in statistics, and I don't know where they went, right? But somehow I was not informed. I happened to be there by accident, And here I am today speaking. So I call this divine intervention 1. Right. There was also the in-service statistics training course, and because of the exposure I had in 1983 and 1985, I was able to lead the demographic training component of that in 1986. And another major highlight of that period was what I like to refer to as the early social indicators movement. Because we knock CSO in Trinidad and Tobago, but in many ways, CSO in Trinidad and Tobago was ahead of the game, lifting way above, punching way above its weight class, and in many ways, doing things that many major national statistical offices in some of the developed world were doing. And for CSO in the Caribbean, for a national statistical office in the Caribbean to be working on social indicators in 1975, that says volumes. And CSO was such an organization. Of course, that work was guided by the UN document toward a system of social and demographic statistics. The social indicators report that you see here was done by Mr. Leo Cuadras, who was the second director of statistics of the CSO. He led the charge on this. And then in 1984-85, he asked me if I would take on the preparation of the second social indicators report, which I gladly accepted as a challenge. And this is the outcome of the work that I'd done back then in terms of developing the second social indicators report for Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, this was a guide. Leo Cuadras was the kind of guy who was very willing to share knowledge, and he introduced me to this book and said, take a read of it, and I read it. And up until today, it guides a lot of my thinking about social indicators and the whole evolution of indicators, generally speaking, to the extent that today we speak about the sustainable development goals and all of the indicators associated with the SDGs and so on. So again, you know, CSO was ahead of the pack in that regard. And what you see here is again, you know, somewhat of a disenchantment with, you know, attitudes for training in the public sector. I felt that, you know, it was, well, it's your turn now to get training, and there was always a carrot and a stick kind of approach to training, and I really abhorred that kind of approach, and I decided, you know, I wanted to go out on my own and really advance my training in demography and statistics, and started making moves. But of course, there was a Cedar Siladi opportunity that came through, and divine intervention number 2 happened because it so happened that the 3 schools that they are targeted, Western Ontario, Montreal, and Alberta. I was already talking to Western Ontario and virtually had my door in, the door opened at Western Ontario, and so on. So basically, I took the opportunity, I applied for the scholarship, and the rest was history. And this lady here, Basia Zaba from Poland, I mean, she was very instrumental in encouraging me. Somehow she saw something that was making sense for demography and pushed me and pushed me and pushed me, and here it is, you know. I think, you know, I'm pleased with her effort. So we move on to Western Ontario now. And at Western Ontario was a beautiful place. The university campus was like a golf course in the middle of the forest, so to speak. It was a beautiful place to be and really encouraging. I met some key persons there, in the likes of Eddie Banks from Jamaica and Fernando Rajultan from India. They were my master's thesis supervisor, my PhD dissertation supervisor, respectively. And of course, these were all super mentors. Of course, Eddie was a demographer, specializing in the Caribbean and Latin America. And I think in many ways, you know, he facilitated my appreciation of an engagement in scholarship in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially with respect to the contribution of demography to development process. And likewise, I think in terms of Fernando Rajolton, when I worked with him, of course, he also, both of them mentors, colleagues, dearest friends, and so on. And they too, he in particular facilitated my appreciation and engagement in scholarship that was associated with advanced quantitative techniques in formal demography and in statistics. So again, you have these figures bringing some really crucial vibes in your life. And then within the department itself, you know, you had the likes of Anton Alaha, who emphasized, you know, the value of sociological theory, philosophy of science, in whatever it is you're doing. I had the likes of Jim Cote, who really brought home research methodology and its links to philosophy of science. Paul Maxim, who, in terms of advanced research design, Rod Bourgeot in terms of, you know, population policy, population dynamics, and how they mix and combine. And then last of all, but not least, Doug there, who really brought home advanced multivariate statistics, structural equations modeling, and evaluation research. And I'm talking about all of this because you will see when we talk about development statistics, these are the kinds of skills that you need. And these are the folk who helped to make it happen. So when I see what is going on, I think, you know, I have no choice but to reflect on these individuals and the contribution that they would have made in making all of it happen. So to cut a long story short, this is the bag of skills that you really need. First and foremost, I'm not saying it's exhaustive, but first and foremost, this bag of skills would really take you a long way in terms of appreciating the role of development statistics in advancing the kind of work we do in terms of shaping and achieving development agendas. And clearly, the end result of all of this was, you know, when I went through Western, my PhD thesis on relative risks and tempo of childbearing in Trinidad and Tobago and in the Dominican Republic, of course, using survey data. And my master's thesis was based on correlates of fertility in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, using data from the World Fertility Survey that I spoke about earlier. And I'm speaking about this because, you know, we want to do research and we want answers on the basis of research, but we don't do the bloody surveys. And somebody has to spend the money on the surveys, and we just don't, but we want answers. And this is something I'm going to be talking to later on. So here comes ISA Solesis. And in terms of ISA, in terms of Solesis, I could say for many years when I entered ISA and Solesis, I represented UE at the Standing Committee of Caribbean Statisticians meeting. And I think I represented UE because of the engagement, the earlier engagement that I had in the statistics community in the region, right? And that exposure and coming back to UE, I did have this burning desire to really say, well, yes, I'm a demographer, but there's something I have to do for statistics while at UE. ISA morphed into Solesis and was established, and Solesis was established in 1979. The first thing we did was the in-service training course for statistical workers in the CSO. I led that, and I had a number of UE colleagues coming to deliver on that. Then there was a training in applied social statistics around 2000, which was a revenue generation effort by SALISIS, the early SALISIS, mainly public servants and young professionals, and we had some participants from other Caribbean islands. Then there was a summer intensive regional demography workshop, which was held annually between 2006 2009. Every year between 2006 2009, we had at least 25 persons coming from about 18 countries across the Caribbean region to be trained in demographic analysis. And that was a set of training led by Professor Tukudum Uche, better known as Chooks, and myself. We led that, right? And trained over 100 professionals across the Caribbean region, across national statistical systems in the Caribbean to undertake demographic analysis. Of course, this training was done under the auspices of CARICOM in the main, with funding from UNECLAC and funding obtained through UNECLAC in the first instance, but mainly from the Caribbean Development Bank in a sense. And then we also trained in conducting the national censuses of 2010. We trained senior statisticians and administrators, Professor Uche and I. Again, we spent 2 weeks in Ocho Rios, Jamaica, conducting such training to ensure that, national statistical offices had the tools and they were equipped to do this. And more recently in SALISIS, we offered training in 2022 in our studio, which is a statistical program that deals with, the modern developments associated with the data revolution. And right now, as we speak, we are completing a UN massive open online course, a UN MOOC on administrative data collection as it relates to violence against women and girls. And we have trained 2 cohorts of workers who engage in this type of development activity. And we have trained them in a variety of areas, including gender relations, statistical data collection, statistical data analysis, qualitative research techniques, among other critical disciplines. Now, in the MSc Development Statistics, I want to say a few things about the MSc Development Statistics, and all of these people have made it happen, the MSc Development Statistics. There are additional folks who we don't have their photos, but so you see, it's an amalgam of persons with an amalgam of skills, and skills that at the end of the day, when you think about the skills, they dovetail with the bag of skills that I was speaking about earlier. And I want to thank all of these persons who contributed wholeheartedly and demonstrated tremendous commitment to the cause in terms of enabling the MSc in Development Statistics that SALISIS has been running since 2008. Of course, this is one of the courses this is one of the programs that was born out of my engagement with the SCCS, the Standing Committee of Caribbean Statisticians. I went to these meetings religiously every year representing the university, and they would say, what is the university doing for the statistics community? What is the university doing for the national statistics system? And I felt compelled to come back to the university and say, hey, we have to get this thing going within SALISIS. And I have to thank in particular Professor Patrick Watson and Professor Andrew Downs. They were the directors at the time, and they saw the wisdom in it, and they supported it, and it happened. Of course, I had to do all of as they would say, deliver the elbow grease to make the thing happen, and it did happen. So Here you go. When you look at it over the years, these are the statistics with respect to enrollment and so on. At the end of the day, we graduated, at least 106 persons have graduated from the program since 2008. It's not a very big program, so you would see that we have had 219 persons who have applied. Not all of them have been accepted, and of course, some who had been accepted either dropped out or perhaps were asked to withdraw from the program based on performance. But 106 graduating is, as far as we are concerned, really good going, and we are pleased when we look at, where some of these persons are placed. Of course, again, when you look at the small size of our program, I think, this array of countries represent how international we could be. And I think given this size and using my statistician instincts, given the size of the program, and when you see the list of countries here, perhaps the variability associated with the country of origin of our students, we can pass boast and say, we have the greatest variability, which is a good sign whenever you offer training and you attract people from different countries and so on. So you can see that we have gone beyond Trinidad and Tobago and attracted people to our program. And I think this augurs well for what we had been trying to do along the way. Now, what you see here is just a list of some of the research papers that were done by some of the students that I would have supervised. They cut across a number of areas, including a lot of the papers look at, population projections. A lot of these papers focus on critical development issues that revolve around populations and subpopulations and serving the needs of subpopulations, being able to engage in measurement. So, for example, Anissa Duncan speaks of, in her paper, her paper is entitled Measuring Civic Engagement in the Young Adults and the Extent of Their Use of the Internet as an Outlet to Express Political Voice. So strictly a measurement paper, but would have significant policy significance when you look at it, right? You have Sinead Dyer projecting the demand and distribution of primary school teachers, the case of Belize 2010-2050. So as you look through these papers, you will see it's not only about Trinidad and Tobago, it's about St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it's about St. Lucia, it's about Barbados, right? We find the data and we try our best to see, what we can say by way of the kind of research these students have been doing. And a lot of it is really about development, actually relying on population projections that tell us about who the people are, like, what kind of numbers we will be looking at come 2030, 2040, based on mathematical models, based on statistical principles that are related to how, we establish connections between statistical facts and so on, right? This is the kind of thing that our students have been doing and have been trained to do. And this is essentially what development statistics is all about, right? And then I could say from my particular standpoint, I have had contributions with respect to the St. Lucia, writing the National Census report for St. Lucia in 1990, based on the St. Lucia census, and using the census data, all of the census data, to demonstrate how the statistics can tell a story about St. Lucia at the time of the census and what kind of prescriptions can be made for St. Lucia regarding its future based on population variables and that sort of thing. And in 2000, Professor Uche and I, we edited not 19 country studies, it's 18 country studies. We edited 18 country studies based on the 2000 census data, doing the same kind of thing. And we also edited 5 regional census topic monographs, right? And in that period as well, while at Salises, of course, I have done my own research. I'm only focusing here on the research that relates to specifically to development statistics, but I've done a whole lot of other research on a wide array of other topics, drawing on qualitative research designs and so on. So this is the St. Lucia report that I would have written, right, back in response to the 1990-1991 census data. These are the chapters, right? It's 11 chapters that were written on. The last one looking at population projections for St. Lucia, right? And of course, these are the country reports. These are the ones that I edited. And you can see a range of different authors. We trained the authors to write these reports, and they wrote the reports. And you can see some familiar names here, right? Who are some of the people. Elizabeth Talbot right now is now the head of the UNFPA and so on. And we have some other, Linda Hewitt among others, right? These are some really powerful people who have been writing these reports, but Uche and myself, we operated as the editors, reviewing and so on. And this is a set that Professor Uche would have reviewed. And again, you can see some other names. Patricia Anderson stands out as a powerful professor of sociology on the Mona campus. Frank Mills, Elizabeth Talbot again, Valerie Nam. These are some very powerful names. And this is what these reports look like. These reports are available. I wonder how many people have actually been using these reports. They are produced under the umbrella of CARICOM, right? And of course, the regional topics and so on. Now, this is just a snippet of some of the papers that I have written and published, drawing on the principles of development statistics. And I've just highlighted the areas. So one of the papers looks at youth policy. The other one looks at homicide, violence, governance arrangements, population dynamics, resilience building. All of these are development themes coming out of, research that I have done, drawing on all of the principles of development statistics that I've spoken of. Then it continues, one on missing girls, poverty, popular culture. The one on popular culture is really an attempt to demonstrate how population dynamics could actually frame what is actually happening and could happen to Carnival as a popular cultural expression in a Trinidad and Tobago context, right? Social vulnerability, I was actually playing around with a measurement framework to gauge this whole concept of social vulnerability. Safety promotion, in terms of road safety promotion, labor market challenges, family and living arrangements. All of these are themes that come out of some of the work that I did. And then what you see here is just a snippet from a paper that I already submitted for publication, and it should be out soon. And it's really looking at some data I collected for 19 countries. And we keep talking about, countries and how serious COVID was as far as the experience of different countries are concerned. This paper would actually bring it out in terms of severity and spread, right? And what I look at here is, 4 quadrants that speak to, levels of vulnerability. So quadrant 1 is the lowest vulnerability, quadrant 4 is the highest vulnerability. Right? And in terms of severity, when we talk about severity in terms of the fatality associated, you will see that these countries here are among the countries that were highly vulnerable as a result of the fatality data that were collected. And I use a range of clever statistical indicators to figure out which countries would fall in which of the quadrants that speak to the vulnerability issue, so to speak, right? So I'm coming closer to the end now, right? I had a lot to say. I think, you know, at this point, I want to say a few things by way of disappointments. And I know that the 2020 round of censuses in the Caribbean was seriously impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, census taking is an absolutely critical exercise in any Caribbean country, right? And I don't think, you know, having had COVID-19, that it's an excuse for not undertaking the census. Several Caribbean countries have already begun and have already begun planning to take their census well before 2025. However, there are a few countries that are still behind. And I just want to urge those countries to make it happen. Because you do not take a census, that's a travesty to development justice in your country, right? You're really messing seriously with your development trajectories if you do not take a census. So I'm really saying this to just urge countries, just in case you're slipping behind and you're lapsing, try to find the money and get your census done. I applaud those countries that have completed their census, that perhaps at a point where they can begin to analyze the data, right? I spoke about, you know, the census analysis reports that I have worked on with others. We need to keep these things going. We need to be able to build capacity to keep these things going. The other thing I want to say, speak specifically to Trinidad and Tobago, right? And I'm saying this because I'm at the end of the road in terms of my career, right? I started in the CSO in 1980. And when I started in the CSO in 1980, I met a superstructure there that was put in place in 1976. That superstructure has not changed. 43 years later. 43 years later, the CSO is operating under the same superstructure. If you listen to some of the things I said before about the CSO of the 1980s and late 1970s, notwithstanding the trials, even with a new superstructure, things were happening that made the place a glorious place. You can't expect a glorious place if after 43 years, nothing much, if anything, has been done to change the superstructure. This brings me to the NSITT, the National Statistical Institute of Trinidad and Tobago. That is yet to bear fruit. I remember being called upon to serve on that task force that was established to facilitate the NSITT. That was in January 2016. Right? January 2024. If the NSITT is not in place, that would be 8 years, right? Already, the work that had been done based on the 2016 effort, already that work is out of date. It is outdated. And it is outdated because of the pace of the global data revolution. So even if you want to go and put an NSITT in place come 2024, you're in problems. Now, another pet peeve of mine is that in Trinidad and Tobago, notwithstanding recent developments, Superior has now become a borough. Diego Martin has now become a borough. But there's no objective process for determining what is urban, what is rural, what are urban and rural spaces in Trinidad and Tobago. And way back in his 1974 work on the population of Trinidad and Tobago, Harewood was already talking about 60% of the population of Trinidad and Tobago being urban. 60%, 66% to be exact, if I'm not mistaken. And in more recent times, I've seen estimates in the vicinity of 70 to 75%. You cannot have international documents making a claim that just 14% of Trinidad and Tobago is urban. And it's simply because they just look at the population of Port of Spain, San Fernando, and Arima, Point Fortin, and take those populations relative to the population of the country and come up with an estimate. You cannot have that. More recent figures, however, that I looked at, I see it bumped up to 53%. I don't know where they got 53% from in some of the UN reports. But it is something that has to be addressed, right? And I think, you know, in many ways, we have dropped the ball in terms of data collection. And I'm not placing the blame on the CSO. The blame has to go elsewhere. Because CSO cannot work with what they do not have. In terms of achievements, I remember in my days at CSO, they used to talk about, you know, the Caribbean Institute for Statistical Training and Research, SISTAR. It never happened. Many countries around the world and regions around the world do have their own Institute for Statistical Training and Research. But I know within the context of CARICOM, the CARICOM Secretariat and the Regional Statistics Unit within the CARICOM Secretariat, there's talk about establishing an e-SISTAR. And if this, an electronic SISTAR, and if this can come into being, this would be a seriously positive thrust in terms of advancing the training of statistical workers, statisticians, and those allied to statistics who need such training. There has also been the establishment of the Caribbean Association of Professional Statisticians, and I'm pleased to state that I am now the vice president of that association. And CSO Trinidad and Tobago, again, this attests to the power of the CSO in Trinidad and Tobago. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was actually a journal, a CSO research papers, CSO in Trinidad and Tobago actually published a journal with high-level papers published by statisticians. Somewhere along the line, that effort waned. But today, we can speak in terms of a Caribbean-wide effort, the Journal of the Caribbean Association of Professional Statisticians, that has emerged out of the Caribbean Association of Professional Statisticians. And in there lies a journal, and we have already published the inaugural issue of that journal. So this shows you the CSO research papers, and you can see if you look at your screen, you can see the kind of papers that were published there. There's one paper here, The State of Crime in Trinidad and Tobago. This was published in June 1967. But high-level publications, CSO research papers. And what you see here is the inaugural issue of the Journal of the Caribbean Association of Professional Statisticians. I am the editor-in-chief of that journal, and we published our first issue. We have a few of the papers. It might not be easy for you to read it, but we do have our journal and are forging ahead with it. By way of recommendations in closing, I just want to say, well, one of the recommendations I want to proffer is that statistics should be offered as a CSEC subject, right? I think it is important to begin with winning allies for statistics, whether it is statistics to serve national statistical offices or statistics, if only to be clever users and producers of statistics. It is important to start winning allies and to recognize that statistical expertise is required across the board, regardless of what professional area you may find yourself in. You have to make decisions, and you have to make decisions based on being able to interpret cleverly statistical information. So what about statistics as a CSEC subject? I think that is something to be considered. Also, I think the University of the West Indies and its university courses should really think about, how do we come up with a university course that all students should do to demystify statistics, because we have to use statistics. Even when we read in newspapers and people are quoting statistics, we have to be in a position where we can make clever decisions based on our interpretation of what is presented to us in the form of statistical information. The apprenticeship programs within the national statistical offices, not only in Trinidad, but across the region, I think this is something all national statistical offices, and by extension, the national statistical system, where students engage in development policy, where agencies engage in development policy work, drawing on quantitative skills can actually help students to see the relevance of, statistical data and statistical information in decision making. I want to talk now, and this would justify why I made reference to the World Fertility Survey earlier on. I made a point about, this survey came on board because there was this need to find ways of, triggering reductions in fertility. Right now, our Caribbean countries are going to find themselves in serious situations because of fertility decline. Most countries have below replacement fertility. And the trigger associated with that the problem associated with that is really how do we ensure that we have populations that are of sizes that are sufficiently sustainable to push the kind of development. And many countries are talking about, encouraging migrants to come to their countries. We have to find ways to figure out how we can perhaps get the fertility rate back up. And I think sexual and reproductive health surveys might be able to help us to do that. Jamaica is one of the countries that has done such. Several other countries need to do it. We need to do the living standards measurement surveys for obvious reasons. And last of all, I think, insofar as we talk, I made this statement about wealth in the context of development. Statistical offices have to embrace the concept of comprehensive wealth and engage capacities to measure the 5 principal capitals that are associated with comprehensive wealth. How do we measure produced capital? How do we measure human capital? How do we measure natural capital? How do we measure social capital? And the easiest of them all, how do we measure financial capital? We have to be able to do those kinds of things. And with that, I end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. St. Bernard. We have a barrage of questions waiting for you. I'm sure time will run out on us, but let's start with first, but Justice Anthony Godfrey posed about 3 questions. I think one of which you would have answered in the course. But second question he asked, what advice would you offer to persons interested in pursuing a career in this field? Can you unmute?
Well, in terms of advice, I would think that the data revolution is galloping at a rapid pace. And the statistician that I have been for the past 40 years is not the statistician that those who aspire to enter the field would be in the 40 years to come. There's a new suite of skills, and I think the data revolution in and of itself is likely to make those who enter the field engage in a process that I would think would turn out to be much more rewarding. Because if you look at, some of the emerging professional pursuits and the capacity of such pursuits to attract high incomes, anything that deals with data analytics and being able to engage in using code to manipulate statistical data. Once you are working within the confines of that data revolution, you will do well. But of course, to get there, some of the background training that I've alluded to, you need to have it. But there's much more happening out there. And I think, there's a bright future for those who have aspirations of engaging in statistics as a career.
In rapid succession, have you done a research study to assess the extent to which the MSc program is realizing its objectives? Where are the graduates being placed in private and public sector organizations? So what type of jobs are they doing?
We haven't had a chance to do that kind of tracer study. Of course, that calls for additional resources, which, given the size of the institute, it's virtually impossible for us to do it. But we do keep in touch with our alumni, and we know that there are some success stories out there. We know, for example, that many of our alumni have gone on to do PhDs and have since obtained PhDs. We know of a few of them who have obtained PhDs. We know of those who have gone on to work with reputable international organizations. Quite a few of them have found their way into the UN system. A number of them work in other organizations such as the Caribbean Development Bank, the IDB. We have one who is based as a university professor in Africa. A number of them have become, I know of quite a few who have obtained promotions within their respective national statistical systems. And one in particular, I met just about 2 weeks ago at a statisticians meeting, and she is now the director of statistics in her country, and so on. So, and I can speak of another one in particular who worked with the CAPA, the Crime and Problem Analysis Unit, that produces all of the statistics on crime and violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And she is now in Canada because the Canadians have recognized her work, and they have taken her on board. And she is doing the same thing in a supervisory capacity in Toronto. And the list goes on. But it is something that I think is a worthy exercise to do at this juncture in the history of the program. And I say this because left to me, I would think, the program has to be transformed to take on the new areas of scholarship and the new areas of practice that are consistent with the data revolution that is taking place.
Another question, what is the status of data ethics? I'm muted. Status of data ethics. Okay. What's the status of data ethics in the Caribbean?
Okay, in terms of data ethics, I think first and foremost, if you are collecting data within the national statistical systems, every country has its own statistical ordinance. And in many ways, the statistical ordinance that drives, the legislative arrangements that involve, that speak to the role of the National Statistical Office in overseeing the production and consumption of data that are used for whatever purposes they are used. Additionally, beyond the statistical ordinance that drives, national statistical systems and the work that they do, what you see happening in the Caribbean now increasingly is anybody who is collecting data, primarily those collecting data for research purposes, you have to go through ethics review committees. And in many ways, the ethics review committees would provide some kind of oversight that will protect, in many ways, the ethical arrangements that underlie the use, the consumption, and the production of data.
Another question has been coming forward. What's the status of demography as a discipline today in the CSO and at the university itself?
Could you repeat the question?
The status of demography in the programs of university and at CSO.
That's a very good question, because I brought up the issue of Linda Hewitt and Desmond Hunt as demographers in the CSO, particularly during the 1970s and the 1980s. Desmond Hunt, if I'm not mistaken, left the CSO sometime in the late 1980s, and Linda Hewitt left the CSO sometime in the early 1990s. And I don't think since their departure, there has been a demographer in the CSO. That, to me, is another travesty as far as development justice is concerned, because you cannot have an institution that is charged with the responsibility of producing national statistics that relate to demographic events, particular births and deaths, and estimating population sizes, whether on the national level or at the local level without any capacity to really ensure that those data are reliable and valid. Somebody has to recognize that there's need for training and make such training available. Enough of that has not been happening. And when I say training, it's not just that you have to mount a course in demography and have them go and do this course in demography. You have to send them to a university and ensure that they understand what demography is about from the ground up. It is not putting a plaster on a sore, right? And this is what prevailed when the CSO had the likes of a Linda Hewitt and a Desmond Hunt that they do not have today. In terms of the university, the Mona campus takes tremendous credit for training in demography in the UWI system. And I think it is the only campus of the UWI where you can still find a seriously active program that trains people in demography. I think it is totally non-existent on Kville, and it is almost non-existent on the St. Augustine campus, except for what we have been doing in Salisis. And if the university is serious, because even when I look at the university and what's happening in the university with respect to declining enrollment, for years I have been making the point that this is a demographic phenomenon that is a reflection of the national demographics, and nobody is listening. And the enrollment will continue to go down, if only because of declining fertility in all of the countries that, provide populations for the university enrollment package. And they're just not listening. And there are other forces, of course. I can spend another hour talking about them, but I'll stop here.
I just want to share with you, Godfrey, that there have been several positive feedback that is in the chat, among which Professor Bridget Burton talks about you're bringing academic knowledge and expertise to bear on regional development as being the central mission of the university. She says your work exemplifies that research, editing, and teaching and training are critical in terms of shaping the future brand of academics that we expect in university. Professor Emeritus Carl Theodore also mentions that the regional focus is admirable, and that is what UWI always should stand for. So there are lots of positive comments, too much to read, but I'm sure you get a chance to review in detail. Lots of your students have sent congratulations and talked about how your impact on them has been critical. And I also wanted to mention that Linda Hewitt, before she became a demographer, was a social worker. She studied social work in Jamaica, Mona, Jamaica. And we saw her working with Professor George Roberts in the Department of Sociology at that point and demography at that point in time. So I just getting that social work in. I think we are about to wind up because we don't want to go into the afternoon. But I think it is fair to say that your role as researcher, administrator, lecturer, practitioner, and implementer epitomizes the best attributes of Caribbean scholarship. And you have brought the university and the community together, what we call the connection between town and gown. Our society and our social institutions require your kind of expertise to be trained on developing processes of designing and implementing data management and social problem-solving strategies. We are in a difficult point at in our social history, in our country in Trinidad, and in fact throughout the Caribbean. We need to understand why, what is happening and why is it happening? What factors can be controlled, reviewed, eliminated, changed, and so on. So we just wanted to thank you for your contribution. And out in the streets and in the backyards of Laventille and elsewhere, we consider your contribution as professorial. So with that hint, we hope to see some changes in your title in the future. Thank you very much, and thanks for participating in such a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, and we hope that the next number 9 will continue with or without you. We hope number 9 would be the next edition. Thanks again, Dr. St. Bernard, and thank you all for participating.
Yeah,